certain predictions, even made by some folks internally, about what the future world could look like. And I think there's a wide spectrum of how terrifying versus how beautiful it could be, frankly. And
which one do you want to go with? The beautiful?
Yeah,
beautiful.
That's our whole point. That's the whole reason why we exist, is trying to make sure that the beautiful outcome happens. But like, to do that, we're also trying to be very thoughtful about a lot of the things that could go wrong.
Hey everyone, Matt Curl here with Apollo, and welcome to a very special episode of Rewiring Growth, the Season 1 finale. To close out the season, we're doing something a little different. What you're about to hear is a live conversation that we recorded at Apollo's Next conference this past October. It was a room full of our customers, partners, and go-to-market leaders from across the world who are all building the future of selling in the age of AI. I sat down with Adam Wall, the head of go-to-market infrastructure at Anthropic, the team behind Claude, and one of the most important AI companies in the world. Adam and I go way back, and this conversation felt a little bit like letting the audience listen to how we normally talk about things together. We talked about the evolution of go-to-market tech, what AI is going to eventually replace versus what it's going to unlock, and how Anthropic uses Apollo as a core part of their go-to-market infrastructure. This season has been about showing how the most forward-thinking companies are rewriting their playbooks in real time, and closing it with Adam, live, unfiltered, and in front of hundreds of operators, felt like the perfect way to bring it home. This show is brought to you by Apollo.io, the end-to-end AI sales platform built to help modern sales teams grow. Let's jump into the conversation. Hello, everybody. I'm Matt Curl. I'm the CEO at Apollo, and I'm joined here with Adam Wall, who's the head of go-to-market infrastructure at Anthropic, a company hopefully many of you all have heard of. If not, maybe you've heard of the language model Claude. We're going to talk here in just a second, just to frame it up a little bit. We're going to have a fireside chat and just talk a little bit about Apollo, talk about the space, talk about where things are going. Adam and I know each other for a long time. He and I worked together. I was his boss once upon a time. And so kind of a fun story of I came to Apollo about a year and a half ago and found out Anthropic was a customer. So one of the first people I wanted to talk to was Adam to learn about why and what the use case was. But without going further, just would love Adam to do a quick introduction on himself, can talk a little about Anthropic, and then we'll dive right in.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Super excited to be here and privileged to have the conversation. Like Matt said, I'm Adam Wall. I'm the head of GTM infrastructure at Anthropic. If you aren't familiar with us, we make the LLM Claude and are generally speaking known for making some of the world's most intelligent AI models. And we have this mission of ensuring that the world safely makes this transition through transformative AI.
Hopefully everyone in the audience knows about Anthropic. If not, you should. We'll start off, Adam. Would love to just talk first about, kind of where I went in the opening. Why Apollo? I know we talked about that like 18 months ago when I first joined, but would love to hear from your perspective, and that was part of your remit. But why did you pick Apollo? Would just love to hear about that a little bit.
Yeah, of course. So at Anthropic, we use Apollo as our primary sequencing and engagement platform, as well as our primary data provider for all of our enrichment workflows. And on that enrichment point, even when we are doing data orchestration through other platforms, Apollo is generally speaking sitting at the top of all of those waterfalls as well. But I had the luxury of joining Anthropic very, very early. The GTM team.
You, by the way. Good.
The GTM team was extremely small. I was the first RevOps hire, and so the tech stack was also quite clean. And so I was able to do a really thorough RFP of all of the major players in the space, and Apollo stood out as frankly the only tool that I felt would allow us to consolidate tools instead of buying new ones, and really the ability to have the data in that same overall suite as the engagement platform really set it apart. And then, of course, I think we saw an immediate opportunity to be able to partner in the long term with how Apollo was going to approach AI for GTM and be able to play some part in that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think on our side with Apollo, a lot of what you saw earlier with Tim and Bella, so much that is powered on top of Claude, and it's been an amazing thing for us, and I think it's going to really open up what is possible. So we're very excited, obviously, in case you haven't pieced that together about where AI is going and how it's going to really help simplify and unify the tech stack and make selling easy. And so maybe we can go there next, Adam, and talk about that. You and I have both sort of seen the rise of the rev tech space. I think, even early stage 5-stars, this is back probably 2010. You were the very first person that took us from Nutshell to Salesforce. I think maybe like customer number 3 for Zora, and tools like SalesLoft, Outreach, Clary, Gong didn't even exist back then. And it sounds like you kind of came into Anthropic. You've got this clean slate. What was your thought process in terms of like, why not just go get best in breed in every single tool? Why not grab 15 different tech solutions and slam them all together. Why not do that?
I think in general, I have this philosophy where I usually try to avoid buying super specific point solutions. I like tools that can do more than one thing. I like being able to have optionality in the tech stack offering. And I think also, we had a viewpoint of like, we are also going to try and do as much as we can with our own internal tooling and AI and really trying to push what AI and go-to-market looks like. Wanted to find tools that could also fit within that overall framework. And I think Apollo having a broad offering was appealing across a number of different areas. And like I think for us, we, in addition to the core surface of Apollo, also view it as a building block that we make things on top of and integrate into our workflows in other ways. So one example of this is we use Claude Code to build an experience out of Salesforce where our users can get a set of product users and product telemetry data, and then with one click, send that into Apollo for enrichment to get a better understanding of the demographic profile out of those people and get that back to their inbox. So that's an example, and that was 100% vibe coded, by the way. But that's just an example of how we're using Apollo as part of the backbone of that workflow. But it's perhaps a slightly non-traditional use case in that people aren't directly going into it. So we really like that optionality.
Very cool. I think what doesn't surprise me a lot, just knowing you, and I know many in the audience don't, is that you're very focused on the rep experience. I mean, I remember even when we worked together, Adam did like a great job for me setting foundations of like, what does sales ops, back then we called it, what does sales ops do? And I remember Adam would always sit shoulder to shoulder with the sales team, sit with the inside sales team, actually watch their workflows, watch their jobs. And I think with AI, so much of it is the context. And it sounds like you're using some custom servers, other things to really get that payload to your reps delivered at the right time. How do you think about, that vision for yourself internally at Anthropic with, I mean, we call it panes of glass. You and I've talked about that before, but how do you think about what your reps interface with and how many systems you want them in and how you get the data to them high context and available in a way that's not chasing 15 different solutions?
So first of all, like just the general premise, I 100% agree with. We have far too many surfaces that I think we're asking our reps to engage with today. And I think both the context switching and the tool switching has a real cost both to the actual workflows of the rep as well as the productivity and ROI that you expect to get from all the different tools that you're purchasing. So I think that's a real problem and something that we need to solve. Apollo is certainly a part of like solving that solution. And I think the ability for Apollo to be that one place where you can do everything if you want it to be is incredibly powerful. But as we have with like some of what we're doing, you also have the ability to integrate it with other platforms. You have an API that you can access. I think in the long run, what we do a lot of is we have a lot of MCP servers that are filling into Claude as the central brain, and we have our reps interacting out of that platform. And so I think that optionality and that ability to pull out of different places and connect things is really where a lot of this could be headed. And so like, I wonder, how long is it until all of the tools are kind of connected to a central AI brain? You almost have this concept of like a headless CRM.
Yep.
I don't know. I'm thinking a little bit further into the future with that. But
I mean, we've talked about that before, of like this concept of like, is it eventually just a database and it's a headless CRM? It's, you more have a tool like an interface or a prompting surface that you're interacting with. What advice do you have pragmatically? You obviously an expert on AI, given your background, where you're working. I think, what you're doing is super innovative. What advice might you have for, lots of different people in the audience with different types of tech stacks, some early, some very advanced, some with large RevOps teams, some with maybe one or none. How should a person think about getting started with this concept of building the right way towards an AI future or an agentic future? What would you, sort of speak to the RevOps folks in the audience? What would you advise them to do?
I think one thing which is perhaps a little bit less AI specific, but more general with RevOps, I've had the benefit of working in a lot of different industries, a lot of different company stages. And, shocker, they're all quite different from each other. And so I think this will sound really simple, but I think it's important to remember that with RevOps, you are an operator and you are responsible for solving the challenges of the business that you are in. And so in some cases, that may not be the platonic ideal of exactly what you're wanting to build, but it's the problem you have. Even if you can build like the best AI workflow in the world, for example, like if you don't have your ICP dialed and if you don't have good product market fit, like none of that is going to matter. So you need to be connected to your business. What you were talking about before, like sitting with the reps, understanding your sales team, understanding your customers, all of that is super, super important. And is something I think you need to keep in mind. And then on the AI side of things, I would say I have a pretty strong belief that it's important for us to be augmenting our sales team, helping make our sellers better and smarter and faster, but not having the goal of automating them away entirely or trying to replace our thinking. I think like the last thing we want across a variety of different areas is more AI slop out there in the world. And so keeping them thinking and keeping them doing what makes them special as humans and not creating sales brain rot, I'll say, is important.
You mean not the generic email saying, I know you went to Pepperdine. We did this thing and that tradition there. Let's talk about that tradition and how it relates to this product that's not at all touching that.
The crazy thing
you don't like that? Does that convert?
I actually experimented with some of that back in, I think it was like 2013, and it really worked back then as a shocker, whether it was like new to the market.
It reminds me of like, do you remember the software that came out that was, I mean, many of the audience, do y'all remember that era where people would like write your company name by hand on like an easel on a whiteboard? I remember like the first time I saw that, I was like, oh my gosh, this is magic. But then it loses very quickly its effectiveness, right?
With that one, I wonder a little bit, because if you do that, you at least know well, actually, that's not even true anymore. Yeah, that's but like, that's a good point. In theory, something that identifies that this is a real human I'm talking to, I think has value.
Okay. So we've talked about this. I think I also agree with you. I've lived squarely in the camp of augmentation. I think what AI can do is really enhance sellers and get them back to the real point, which is how to spend your time selling. There's Sandler sales methodologies talk about this so much of like, you've got to spend your time in the money zone and you've got to go be effective at selling, not effective at navigating 20 different pieces of software, which has been the shift. But in that, replacement versus augmentation world, how does that shape your lens in terms of how you build for your teams at Anthropic? And again, advice you might think for folks here of like, how should they approach building?
Yeah, I think with everything that we try to build, it's like, this should be a tool that allows you to leverage your thinking. And I think that's one of the reasons that I love what Apollo is doing with the AI assistant, where it's taking this broad offering, but it needs to start with a strategic plan that the seller has, and then AI is helping them to execute it and automate it. And so in a lot of cases, we have solutions where like we actually could automate this a little bit more. We could go a little bit further with automatically updating more fields in Salesforce, automatically doing more of the workflow. But in some cases, we intentionally hold back a little bit because
that's super interesting.
Yeah, because the thought process and having the rep like truly know what's going on, I think is important. And like we don't do this at Anthropic, but like I remember one thing that we did way back in the day at 5 Stars was we had like our metrics sheet where we would enter in the numbers of what everyone is doing on a hill. Yeah. But like there was a certain degree to which, even though we could have automated that sheet,
not doing it was better.
I liked entering the numbers manually every week because I felt the number. Like when I typed in that this person was 60% to goal, like I felt that in my soul, And so like,
and rare, I'm telling you, rare breed for RevOps persona. Like, I mean, super customer empathetic and like sales empathetic. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think like with everything, like there's a balance to how much do you automate versus like how much do you really want that thing to more facilitate a conversation and like a business decision. And I think understanding the goal of each of those workflows and what you're really trying to do is important. And like blind automation, I'm not really in favor of.
Got it. How do you think about like on the sales side, the skills development and not, that's the thing I've heard a lot from sales leaders I've talked to, SDR leaders I've talked to, is skill atrophy. I've done some series where I've talked to some folks, and it's been interesting to hear that the more they're automating away, it's almost evaporating the ability to know the product, know the craft. And yes, it's amazing that you can do this stuff to augment and give some of the right answers, but you can also inadvertently harm the core skill that makes someone amazing at their craft of selling. Again, kind of same question on that vein. How do you all think about doing that at scale at Anthropic? You're at a scaling point, and building that craft of how to sell and how to be perfect at selling and how to, really be effective there while also bolstering the right AI signals. So I know you're hitting on it a little bit, but maybe you can go a little bit deeper. Like, what's the Adam Wall recipe of success in your head when you say automate versus I'm going to hold back?
And first of all, that's absolutely a danger. I think like with sales, there's this narrative out there. I think that we can replace sales. We should have machines doing all of this. And I think what goes into that is kind of this underlying belief that sales is highly deterministic. It's programmable. And that it is something that can be easily replaced. But I think if you've gone through a really good sales process, you know a lot of that isn't true. You know that there is value to that human connection, and you know that sales is more than just order taking and answering questions. And so even in a world where we could fully automate the sales process with AI avatars or whatever, I think there's a lot of like ethical concerns and things like that we really need to be thoughtful about. To bring that home in terms of like how I think about these workflows, I'm like, when we're automating an AI workflow, it's with the goal of obviously like solving some problem that is below the thinking level of what we want that person to do, and to give them more time back to do other things. And so if we take away a task that we are going to be automating with AI, I want that to be replaced with a different function that enables higher order thinking for that seller. And so if we're taking away like your with our BDRs, for example, like if we're helping you to auto score a lot of your inbound responses, I want that to allow you to have more time to do really truly strategic ABM thinking with the AEs that you're paired to, like in the upper levels of the enterprise. And so like I'm not just like automating away that BDR resource and taking away entirely. I'm doing that so that BDR can up-level their thinking and skill and can then subsequently do different things. And so for me, it's like automation results in upskilling. It's not automate so we don't need to upskill.
I love what you're saying there. I think it's like a really good framework too of driving that efficiency, but it's efficiency on the tasks that matter and efficiency on the things that take higher order thinking that LLMs are not great at. And I think maybe I can go there next. You've picked your brain a lot on AI and like, how does it even work? What's the foundation? I think some of the stuff you've shared with me has been, it's so important to have context. That, AI sans context isn't particularly effective. I think, even when I'd shown you the AI assistant, you were talking about how great you are at prompting really does matter. If you give a very narrow, shallow prompt, expect a pretty narrow, shallow return. But if you can give something more specific and interesting, it does a lot more for you. How do you think about getting that context into your whole ecosystem? And how do you think about the way in which companies are going to take that context and eventually optimize their go-to-market to accomplish what you're talking about and letting the reps do the more hard to do tasks that AI can't see, can't read the body language on a call, or, someone sort of not committing effectively to a timeline or saying, we might have budget, we might not. There's a lot of nuance in there. I think that's what you're hitting on. But how do you plan to take all of this context that's happening at Anthropic, and how would you advise other people to say there's so much context in your sales process? And with a RevOps brain, it's not just what happens in sales. It's the marketing ether. It's the sales ether. It's what happens after you sell them and the onboarding experience and success. All of that lends itself to customer context. Who is this person? What is our relationship with them? And I know you care a lot about RevOps, the whole customer. How do you plan on attacking that at Anthropic? What advice would you have for the audience in terms of holistic story and holistic context so tools like Claude can really take you to the next level?
I think this is all going to evolve very, very rapidly in the next year, and already has. Like in Anthropic, we were the creators of MCP, or Model Context Protocol, which has become like largely the industry standard for creating agentic workflows. And so we leverage that a lot, obviously, in terms of bringing a lot of different tools together and bringing in context. We're also big believers right now, at least, of everything winds up in the data warehouse. So basically every tool we can, we're trying to like get that data into the data warehouse, and then Claude has an MCP connection with BigQuery, which is our data warehouse, to be able to bring that in as context. And so that's how we're tackling it today. I think this could certainly change in the future, and I think different tools like Apollo are getting much better at being the home where all of that context could live, to simplify that if you don't have like the enterprise resources that maybe we're toying with. But I think in terms of how you bring that to life, one other thing that we're very intentional about at Anthropic is prompting is a cultural skill that we value. So it's like, it's not
how
just
do you coach that? Like, how do you coach that?
I mean, it's part of onboarding and training.
Is it really?
Yeah. So it's like every new hire learns how to Claude, and like goes through sessions there, and like looks at prompt libraries and builds stuff with Claude Code. We have our GTM sellers developing software with Claude Code as part of their onboarding.
That's amazing.
And so that being a value, it's like you are expected to know how to prompt to be able to make this go well. I think really helps to kind of have that as a common baseline, which makes all of that go better. Because even if you have the context in a really good place, the models have gotten much, much better at coaching you through prompting, but knowing what's going on there still helps a lot.
Very cool. I know we've got a couple minutes. Let's go like future theory crafting, and just kind of want to pick your brain as a RevOps expert in terms of where you think the space is going. You touched on consolidation earlier and some of these other things. What are sort of your bold predictions? Like, what happens with the sales and marketing tech stack of today in, let's say, a decade? I mean, 1 or 2 years it's obviously like hard to see, but on a 10-year time horizon, I mean, so much changes. What's your prediction? Like, what does it look like? I know you touched a little bit on headless CRM, which maybe those in the audience don't know what that is, but I think what Adam was talking about is, if you have all of this column-wide data, you have a company or a contact, and you have so many columns of data, that's really incredible, and you can go do a bunch of interesting things with that. But what do you what do you think like the space looks like in a decade?
Yeah. Oh man, a decade is so hard to think about.
I know. That's why I asked.
Yeah, and there's certain predictions even made by some folks internally about what the future world could look like, and I think there's a wide spectrum of how terrifying versus how beautiful it could be, frankly. And
which one do you want to go with? The beautiful?
Yeah,
beautiful.
That's our whole point. That's the whole reason why we exist, is trying to make sure that the beautiful outcome happens. But like, to do that, we're also trying to be very thoughtful about a lot of the things that could go wrong. Whether that's like the existential risks, even just down to things like labor disruption and things like that. And so we are trying to think about that and be intentional about it, because if we don't think about it now, I think that's something that could be a problem. And so we need to be thinking about that. But in terms of where the tech stack goes, I do imagine it could be I think it's this thing that's like, everything is happening beautifully.
Like, does Halo exist? It's an interesting question. Like the way
it could exist as a security layer, almost like it's a security and data validation layer. But like, hopefully no one at Salesforce sees, maybe we never need to log in again. And we could avoid that UI. And so, but having it be there kind of as your validation, and being there to help protect your financial rails, and making sure that you have good SOX compliance and all of that different kind of stuff, and staying on track on that perspective. I can see something like that happening in the future.
Last question for you. Suppose you're in the audience and maybe using Apollo and it's sort of your first foray into AI, or you've never attempted AI for go-to-market before. Where would you start? If you were brought in as an advisor to any one of these companies and they're early on that journey, what's the starting point? I know you said earlier, like, get your ICP, fix your foundations of sales, know what you're selling, who you're selling to, but assuming they have that down, they've got sort of that V1 product market fit, where would you start? Where would you go?
First principle, I would ask AI to teach you how to do AI for go-to-market. Right? I think Apollo has a lot of great materials, has a lot of great academy work that you all have done. So, take a bunch of that, give it to Claude, say like, hey, give me a crash course on how to learn all of this, and tell me and teach me what I should do next. It's actually really good at that. And so I think that's a good way. If you don't know where to start, these tools can help you.
Amazing. Well, thanks, Adam, for the time. Really enjoyed the conversation. For those of you in the audience, feel free to grab. That's a wrap on this season of Rewiring Growth and on this special finale. If you've been tuning in this season, you've heard real operators talking about what's happening inside of their teams right now and the honest ways that AI is changing how we all sell. Ending with Adam Wall felt right. He's not just predicting where go-to-market's going, he's building it at Anthropic. And his take brings home the theme we've heard all season long. The teams who win next aren't the ones automating everything. They're the ones staying closest to their customers, using AI to amplify their best people. If Adam's thinking sparked interest and ideas, you can connect with him on LinkedIn or learn more at anthropic.com. Hit subscribe, and if you found this conversation helpful, please continue following along. Thanks for being part of the first season, and as always, you can find us at apollo.io.